He carried his first dying man before he was old enough to vote, and he carried his last one 51 years later, and in between he carried so many that he stopped counting somewhere over the South China Sea on the flight home. His name does not matter here, because for 13 months it had not been a name. It had been a word men screamed when they were hit. They did not scream for their mothers, not at first. First they screamed for the medic, and the word was a prayer and an accusation and a hope all at once, and he had learned to run toward the word instead of away from it, which is the only thing a combat medic ever really learns, and the only thing that cannot be taught. He was 19 when he arrived in country in 1960. He had wanted to be a medic because he did not want to kill anyone. That was the whole of his reasoning, clean and boyish and entirely unprepared for what it would mean. He thought a medic was a person who helped. He did not yet understand that a medic in the field is a person who decides in the half-second a bullet gives you, whose chest you press your hands against, and whose hand you simply hold, while the rest of you moves on to someone who can still be saved. He learned that distinction in his first week. He carried it for the rest of his life. He carried an aid bag that weighed 40 pounds, and he carried morphine syringes pinned to his collar where he could reach them with his teeth. And he carried a rifle. He rarely fired because his hands were usually full of someone else's blood. He carried bandages and tourniquets and the small flat tools of his trade, and he carried the knowledge, unspoken among medics but understood, that the enemy aimed for him first. Kill the medic, and you kill everyone he would have saved. He learned to take the cross off his helmet. He learned to crawl. He learned that the men loved him in a way that frightened him, because their love was really need, and need that total is a weight no 19-year-old should have to carry across a rice paddy under fire. There was one he could not put down. His name was Doern, a kid from Michigan, with a gap in his teeth and a photograph of a girl he was going to marry. Doern stepped on something in the spring of 1970, and the medic was there in 9 seconds. He counted them later, 9, and 9 seconds was not fast enough because there are wounds that 9 seconds cannot answer. He worked on Doern for 11 minutes. He pushed the boy's insides back where they belonged with his bare hands, and he tied off what he could, and he breathed into the boy's mouth, and he did everything the army had taught him and several things it had not, and Doern looked up at him at the end with a clarity that the dying sometimes get and said, "Tell her." That was all, "Tell her." And then the clarity went out of his eyes like a window when someone leaves a room, and the medic was holding a body and the radio was crackling, and somewhere to his left another voice had started screaming the word. He put Doern down. He picked up his bag. He ran toward the word. He never found the girl. That is the first thing the country does not tell you about its medics. It tells you they are heroes. It does not tell you that they spend the rest of their lives carrying undelivered messages, the last words of dying boys addressed to people whose addresses died with them. Tell her. Tell her what? He didn't even know her name. Doern had said it once, on a night when the rain made talking safe, and the medic had not been listening the way you listen when you know a thing will matter, because you never know which night is the one you will spend the rest of your life trying to remember. He came home in 1970. He flew out of Cam Bay on a chartered jet with a stewardess who smiled at him as though he were returning from a business trip, and he landed in California, and the war was simply over for him, like a faucet shut off. There was no decompression. There was no one to talk to. One day he was pressing his hands against a man's severed femoral artery, and 72 hours later he was standing in his mother's kitchen in Ohio, holding a glass of lemonade she had made him, and she was asking if he wanted a sandwich, and he could not answer because he did not have the words for the distance between those two rooms. He thought in the beginning that he would become a paramedic. It made sense. He had skills now, real ones, skills that civilian boys spent years in school to learn, and that he had learned in a place where the final exam was whether the man lived. He went to the county hospital to ask about work. He sat in the emergency room waiting area to fill out an application, and he watched the doors, and he waited, and nothing came in. That was the thing he had not anticipated. The waiting room was empty. A woman with a sprained wrist, a child with a fever, an old man who had fallen. The doors stayed shut and quiet, and the fluorescent lights hummed, and the chairs were the color of nothing, and he sat there with his application going soft in his sweating hands and felt something he had no name for yet. He had spent 13 months in a place where the doors never stopped opening, where the wounded came faster than hands could hold them, where every minute mattered so much that minutes had stopped being minutes and become the only currency that was real. And now he sat in a clean, quiet room where nothing was happening, and his whole body did not know what to do with the silence, and he understood dimly that he had come home to a country with empty waiting rooms, and that he no longer knew how to wait in one. He did not take the paramedic job. He told himself it was the hours, the pay, the commute, and all of those were lies, and the truth was the empty waiting room. He could not sit in a place that asked him to wait calmly for the wounded to arrive, because his body had been recalibrated in a country where you ran toward them, and a job that required him to sit still while his hands stayed clean felt like a betrayal he could not articulate. So he took a job where his hands would stay busy. He went to work at a tire plant outside Akron, and for the next 19 years he made tires, and he was good at it, and almost no one he worked with ever knew that the quiet man on the third shift had once held a boy's life in his 2 hands and lost. The third shift suited him. The world was asleep. The plant ran hot and loud, the machines hissing and stamping in a rhythm that filled the place where his thoughts would otherwise have gone. He liked the noise. Noise was safer than silence, because silence was a waiting room, and a waiting room was where the screaming started in his head. The word men screamed, surfacing out of the quiet like a body coming up from the bottom of a river. He learned to keep noise around him at all times. A radio in the garage, the television on while he slept, an engine running. His wife years later would say she had never once been in a fully silent house with him, and she said it without understanding why, because he had never told her why. He married in 1974. Her name was Carol, and she worked at the diner where he ate his breakfast at the strange hour. Men on third shift eat breakfast 4 in the afternoon, the eggs and coffee of a man whose days run backward. She was kind and uncomplicated, and she did not ask about the war, partly because she sensed she should not, and partly because in those years nobody asked anybody about that war. It was a national agreement. The country had decided to look away from Vietnam the way you look away from someone eating alone, out of a politeness that is really just discomfort, and the veterans had agreed to be looked away from, because being looked away from was easier than being looked at and not seen. They had 2 boys. He was a good father in the visible ways. He coached the baseball team. He fixed the bicycles. He stood at the edge of the school plays with a camera. But there was a glass wall an inch in front of his face, and his sons grew up knowing their father loved them the way you know a thing through glass, clearly and at a distance, and without ever quite being able to touch it. The boys learned the house rules without anyone ever stating them. Don't wake Dad by shaking him. Call his name from the doorway. Don't let the house go silent. Don't ask about the box. The box. There was a box. It was a green metal ammunition can, repurposed. The kind every soldier brought something home in, and it lived on a shelf in the garage above the workbench, and in 19 years of marriage Carol opened it exactly once. She was looking for a fuse. She found instead a stethoscope, which made no sense because her husband made tires and had never been a doctor. She found a length of rubber tubing. She found a small flat tin of something she did not recognize. And she found at the bottom, wrapped in an oil rag, a photograph of a young man with a gap in his teeth, and on the back, in handwriting she did not know, a single word and a girl's first name, Mary Susan. She did not understand it. She thought for one cold moment that Susan was a woman her husband had loved before her. She put the photograph back exactly as she had found it. She closed the box. She never mentioned it, and she carried her own small wrong theory about it for 11 years, which is its own kind of silence, the silence of a woman protecting a marriage from a truth she has misread. The stethoscope was his. He had taken it off a dead doctor at an aid station in 1970, not to steal it, but because the doctor no longer needed it, and he could not bear to leave a working instrument in the mud. He had used it for the rest of his tour. He had brought it home because leaving it felt like leaving a man behind. The photograph was Doern's. He had taken it from the boy's pocket before the body bag. because he had told himself he would find the girl, and he had carried it home, and he had failed, and he could not throw it away because throwing it away was the final admission that tell her would never be answered. So the photograph lived in the box, and the box lived in the garage, and the man lived in the house, and the three of them coexisted for 19 years without ever speaking. The plant closed in 1989. Akron stopped making tires the way half the country stopped making the things it used to make, and the men who had given their backs to it were given a handshake and a notice and a final paycheck, and the silence he had spent 19 years drowning in noise came flooding back into his days. He was 40. He had no third shift to hide in anymore. He had a severance check and a quiet house and a garage with a green box on a shelf, and for the first time since 1970, he had nothing to run toward and nothing loud enough to run from. He started drinking in the afternoons. Not dramatically. A methodical man's drinking, 3 beers while he pretended to organize the workbench, the radio on, his back to the shelf where the box sat. He was not trying to feel better. He was trying to keep the waiting room empty, the one in his head, the one where the chairs were the color of nothing, and the doors stayed shut, and a boy from Michigan sat patiently in the corner, waiting, with terrible 19-year-old patience for a message to finally be delivered. The boy did not stay in the corner. That was the thing about the quiet years after the plant closed. The patience he had imagined in Doern, the willingness to wait, was his own projection, and it ran out the way his ran out, and the boy began to come into the middle of the room. He saw him in the spring of 1990. Not a hallucination, the medic was always careful to say that later, when he could finally say anything. Not a ghost in the way movies mean it. It was the way the mind, held underwater for 20 years, will eventually force its way up for air, whether you permit it or not. He would be standing at the workbench and the light would come through the garage window at a certain slant, late afternoon, the hour he used to eat his backward breakfast, and the smell of cut grass would come in, which was the smell of that spring in 1970, and Doern would be there at the edge of things, 19 forever, gap-toothed, looking at him with that final clarity and saying the 2 words that had organized the man's entire life around a wound. Tell her. He went to the VA in 1990 because Carol made him. She had found him in the garage one afternoon, not drinking, not working, just standing holding the photograph from the box, weeping in a way she had never seen in 16 years of marriage, a dry-mouthed silent heaving that frightened her more than shouting would have. She did not ask who Susan was. She had stopped believing her own theory by then. A man does not weep like that over an old girlfriend. She said only, "You're going to talk to someone." And because he had no noise left to hide in, he went. The VA in 1990 was not the VA of 1972. There was a word now, the one the country had finally been forced to invent because too many men had come home wrong to keep pretending the war had not damaged them. Post-traumatic stress disorder. He sat across from a counselor, a younger man with a kind and careful face, and for a long time he said nothing because there was no place to start that was not the middle. And then the counselor asked the question no one had asked him in 20 years. Not did you see combat, not did you kill anyone. The counselor asked, who couldn't you save? And the room came apart. He told him about Doern. He told him about the 9 seconds and the 11 minutes and the insides he had pushed back with his bare hands and the clarity that went out like a window. He told him about Tell Her and the girl he never found and the photograph in the box. He told him a thing he had never told anyone, which was that he had carried the names, not just Doern, all of them. He had a list in his head, the men he had reached and lost, the ones whose hands he had held instead of saved, and he recited them sometimes at night, the way other men said prayers, because he was the only one left who remembered that they had each had a name before they became a word. Someone screamed. The counselor did not flinch. The counselor wrote nothing down. The counselor simply received it, all of it, and at the end he said, "You've been a medic for 20 years. You just stopped having anyone to treat. We need to find you someone to carry, who can actually be carried." That sentence changed the direction of his life. He began slowly to volunteer. The VA had a program, veterans helping veterans, the older ones sitting with the younger ones coming back from places the country was busy not looking at again. He was good at it in a way that surprised him and did not surprise the counselor at all. He knew how to run toward the word. He knew how to sit with a man in the worst minute of his life and not look away. The skills that had no use in a tire plant had a use here, and for the first time since 1970, his hands were full of someone who could be helped. But Doern was still in the box, and the box still had no answer. It was his son who found her. The older boy, grown now, working with computers in the way of the new decade, heard the story for the first time in 1995 when his father, 25 years sealed shut, began at last to talk. The son did not say much, but he took the photograph and he took the 2 words, "Marry Susan," and the unit and the dates his father could give him, and he did the patient digital archaeology that was just becoming possible. And it took him 8 months and he found her. Her name was Susan Doern, now Susan Doern Albrecht, and she lived in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and she was 46 years old, and she had married a man named Albrecht in 1974 and had 3 children and had spent 25 years not knowing how the boy she was going to marry had died, only the telegram's flat language killed in action, which tells a person everything and nothing. She had built a life over the not knowing the way you build a house over a filled-in well. She did not know there had been a witness. She did not know there had been last words. She did not know that 800 miles away a man had been carrying her name in a green box for a quarter of a century, waiting to keep a promise he had made in 11 minutes of blood and rain. The son gave his father the address. He did not push. He set it on the workbench next to the box, and he said, "Whatever you want to do, Dad." The medic looked at the address for 3 days. He had run toward the word 10,000 times. He had never once been this afraid to move, because for 25 years, tell her, had been an open wound, but it had also been a companion, the last living thread to a boy from Michigan, and to deliver the message was to finally put Doern down, all the way down the way he had put his body down in the paddy, and picked up the bag and run. He had been refusing to do that for 25 years. He sat in the quiet garage with the address in his hand and understood that the empty waiting room had been waiting all this time for him. He drove to Grand Rapids in the fall of 1995. He did not call first. He understood, the way a medic understands triage, that some things cannot be done over a wire, that there are deliveries that require a body in a doorway and a face that can be looked at. He took the photograph from the box. He left the stethoscope behind, on the shelf, which he noticed and did not examine, the first thing he had ever taken out of that box without putting back. He found the house on a street of houses like it. October leaves down, a basketball hoop over the garage, a life. He sat in the car across the street for 40 minutes. He was 56 years old, and his hands, which had not shaken under fire, shook on the wheel. Then he made himself do the only thing he had ever truly known how to do. He moved toward it. A woman answered. He knew her instantly. Though the photograph was 26 years old and she was no longer the girl in it, he saw the girl inside the woman, the way you see the wound inside the man. He said her name as a question, "Susan Doern," and she said, carefully, the way you answer a stranger using a name you have not been called in decades, "I was, a long time ago." He had rehearsed nothing. The man who rehearsed nothing under fire had rehearsed nothing now. He held up the photograph, the boy with the gap in his teeth, and he watched her face change, watched 25 years drop out from under her, watched her hand come up to her mouth, and he said the thing he had carried 800 miles and 25 years and a whole silent life to say. I was with him. At the end, he wasn't alone. He asked me to tell you. His voice did not break because he had written the hour of too many deaths to let it break now. He said, "Tell her." That was the last thing he said. He was thinking of you. "I'm sorry it took me so long. I couldn't find you. I never stopped trying to find you." She did not faint. She did not scream. She stood in the doorway of her ordinary house and she wept. And then she did a thing he had not expected, a thing that undid him completely. She reached out and took his hand, not to shake it, to hold it, the way his father would one day hold his, the way he had held 100 dying boys. She held the hand of the man who had held the hand of the boy she loved, completing a circuit that had been broken in a rice paddy in 1970, and they stood there in the doorway, two strangers joined by a dead 19-year-old, and the message was finally delivered. They talked for 4 hours. She made coffee. She showed him a photograph of Doern she still had, the same gap-toothed grin, and he showed her how to understand the telegram that had told her nothing, filled in the flat words, killed in action with the truth, which was terrible and which was also better than not knowing, because not knowing is its own war that never ends. He told her Doern had not been afraid at the end. He told her a small lie there, the same lie he had carried for the boy from Tennessee in a different man's story, the merciful lie every medic learns to tell, and he told it cleanly, and it was the right thing, and they both knew it was a kindness and not a fact, and they let it be true anyway. He drove home lighter than he had driven anywhere since 1970. Not healed. He would never use that word. Medics do not believe in it, but the boy was out of the box. The boy was at rest. The promise was kept. He took the stethoscope out of the green ammunition can the following week. He did not know why at first, and then he did. He gave it to the VA, to the program, to a young medic just back from the Gulf, who was sitting in the same silence he had once sat in, and he said, "This was carried by better men than me. It's still got work in it." The young man did not understand. He would in 25 years. That is how it passes down. He volunteered at the VA for the rest of his life. He sat in the worst minutes of younger men's lives and did not look away. He went to the dedication of things, the moving wall when it came through, the plaques, the slow public catching up of a country that had spent so long looking away. He never marched. That was not who he was. But he showed up, and he carried the ones who could be carried, and he said the names of the ones who could not, out loud now, no longer only at night. He is in his late 70s. He still keeps noise in the house, the radio, the television, the old habit, but the silence does not frighten him the way it did, because he has learned that the empty waiting room was never empty. It was full of the men he had carried, waiting not to accuse him. He understands that now, but to be remembered. That was all any of them ever wanted. Not to be saved because some of them could not be. Just to be remembered by the one person who had been there in the last 9 seconds, the one who ran toward the word. Susan writes to him at Christmas. Doern's photograph sits on his mantel now, out of the box, in the open, where his grandchildren ask about the boy with the gap in his teeth, and he tells them all of it, in age-appropriate pieces, the way the truth should be handed down, carefully, completely, without being made to wait. 11 minutes, 9 seconds, 25 years. Tell her, he told her. And the country that had let its medics come home to empty waiting rooms learned, one delivered message at a time, one remembered name at a time, what it had asked these boys to carry, and how long they had carried it, and how much it had cost to finally, at last, set it down.